Okay, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We're going to get started. My name is Rajiv Dehejia. I am the Associate Dean, Academic Affairs at NYU Wagner, and on behalf of the school, let me welcome you to tonight's debate. 2 years ago, NYU Wagner and the Century Foundation joined forces to create a public debate series. The goal was to showcase thoughtful, informed dialogue from a diverse range of experts on a range of vital national policy issues. Thus far, we've had 6 debates on higher education, on immigration, on national security, on intervention in Syria, on policing, and on school vouchers. And they have been thought-provoking. And we're delighted to be continuing the series this fall. At NYU Wagner, we have a long history in public service. For more than 75 years, we've been helping our students translate their passion into action so they can make an effective and lasting impact on the public good, both here in New York City and around the world. Our students and alumni apply their educations to making real and positive impacts on people's lives through healthcare, international development, urban planning, nonprofit management, and many other fields of study. Tonight's discussion is important and challenging. We are focused on gentrification and whether the government should take an active role in stopping it. At NYU Wagner, we believe that understanding, if not agreeing with all perspectives on a problem, is essential. Continuing a dialogue such as the one we're having tonight and listening to what both sides have to say is vital to helping us, researchers, students, thought leaders, practitioners, decision makers, and any interested citizen in gaining a greater understanding and hopefully new perspectives, both of which are hallmarks of good citizenship and policy making. I want to offer a warm welcome to our moderator and debaters, Alana Semuels, Michael Greenberg, and Lance Freeman. Thank you very much, all of you. They will receive, thank you all, and they'll receive proper introductions shortly. But indeed, on behalf of NYU Wagner, thank you and welcome for being part of this evening and sharing your thoughts and insights. We are live streaming tonight's debate, so I want to also thank everyone who is joining us online. Your virtual presence is greatly appreciated. When we first began discussing this debate series with the Century Foundation, it was agreed that audience participation was vital to the program, to hearing from everyone who is participating and attending. And there are 2 ways you can join in tonight's conversation and to ask questions. The first of these is via Twitter. And the second is via the old-fashioned index card. So via Twitter, you can use the hashtag DOTC, which should be up, there it is in the upper corner. So the hashtag DOTC via Twitter, or you can, of course, just write your question on an index card, raise your hand at any point, and an usher will pick it up from you. There are also extra index cards available in case you didn't pick up any when you checked in. So before we start the evening's proceedings, we wanted to take your pulse about tonight's topic. Where do we stand now? So we're going to conduct a poll, and then again after the debate to see if opinions have shifted over the course of the evening. So there are 2 ways to join the poll. The first is via text to DOTC. The first is simply texting DOTC to 37607. So simply text DOTC to 37607. And the second way of joining the poll is via a web browser on your phone or any other instrument that you have available, pollev.com/DOTC, and then follow the prompts. There's no need to register or log in. Simply text 37607, writing DOTC, or follow the web browser pollev.com/DOTC. 2 options. And I'm going to give you a second to pursue one of those two options and join in the poll. So the instructions, again, are on the screens, pollev.com/DOTC, and then you'll have a series of prompts. Alternatively, simply text DOTC to 37607. Just going to give everyone a moment to join the poll. So again, if you can't see the screens, it's via text. You can text DOTC to 37607. Alternatively, direct your web browser to pollev.com/DOTC. Okay, so let us turn toward the resolution. Tonight's resolution is the government should stop gentrification. Do you agree or disagree with this statement? Many of you have joined the polls and already responding, so simply text yes, no, or undecided to the resolution. The government should stop gentrification. We've got the results coming in real time. We are beginning with 49, 51, about half of the people just dancing above and below 50%, saying yes to the resolution that the government should stop gentrification. About a quarter of individuals are responding no, and approximately 1/4 are undecided. So that's an interesting starting point. We're going to do another poll after the debate to see if our experts were able to sway any opinions. It is now my pleasure to turn over the stage to our partner in this endeavor, the Century Foundation and its president, Mark Zuckerman.
Thank you very much. Good evening and welcome. On behalf of the Century Foundation, it's my great pleasure to welcome you here to the 7th Debates of the Century. I'm very pleased at the great partnership we have with NYU as we begin our 3rd year of this debate series. First, a warm thank you to the Century Foundation and NYU Wagner team for the time and effort they put into organizing this event, so let's give them a hand. And of course, thank you to our wonderful debaters and moderators who are going to be introduced momentarily. I also want to acknowledge the New York City Transportation Commissioner, Polly Trottenberg, is in the audience today. And she has a very deep interest in this subject and is also my wife, so that's great. Before we get started, just a word about the Century Foundation. We are 98 years old, one of the oldest public policy think tanks in the country. Our experts are leading thinkers and change makers in areas from everything to education equality, to jobs, the economy, civil liberties, healthcare, and foreign policy. To receive our reports and commentaries, you can sign up at tcf.org and get all this great content for free, so I hope you'll do that during today's debate and after. Tonight is all about a public policy issue that New Yorkers in particular are incredibly passionate about. I know this because this debate sold out faster than any other debates of the century. Tonight, we will get to the heart of it. Is gentrification inevitable? Can government or should government try to stop it? Who are the winners and losers from gentrification? And what should policymakers do in response to it? What is our responsibility to displaced communities, and what is the responsibility of the gentrifiers? Fortunately, we have one of the nation's leading journalists on issues of housing and economic mobility, poverty, here to help us navigate this, Alana Semuels. You've certainly read about her reporting in Atlantic magazine, where she is a staff writer and has penned articles including the barriers stopping poor people from moving to better jobs, and Not in My Backyard, to Yes in My Backyard, to States with a Large Population, and Segregation Had to Be Invented. You might have also seen her work in the Los Angeles Times, the Washington Post, Chicago Tribune, and Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. She has a graduate degree in global politics from the London School of Economics and an undergraduate degree in American history and literature from Harvard College. Please join me in welcoming Alana as moderator.
Hi, everybody. So last week, the Denver Cafe Inc. Coffee, which is located in the historically black Five Points neighborhood, put up a sign on its sidewalk. Happily gentrifying the neighborhood since 2014, the sign said. Nothing says gentrification like being able to order a cortado. There was almost immediate pushback, with protests in person and on social media. Longtime occupants felt that the sign was indicative of the blithe attitudes of the neighborhood's new residents, in that it completely disregarded the displacement that can come when an area changes. Debates like this are happening around the country as cities become increasingly popular and expensive places to live. More and more jobs are being created in cities, and workers want to live close to these jobs. They're moving to urban neighborhoods near city centers, increasing demand for housing in these areas. This process has some positives, as we'll discuss. Higher income residents attract businesses like grocery stores that these areas have long lacked. But as more people move into these neighborhoods, rents go up, and long-time, lower-income residents are sometimes forced out. Cities across the world are currently wrestling with how to deal with gentrification. Stopping it entirely could freeze economic development in neighborhoods where it is needed. But allowing market-rate housing to be built without protecting current residents can also lead to displacement. Our two speakers tonight, Michael Greenberg and Lance Freeman, are going to debate what role, if any, the government should play in stopping gentrification. The format will be as follows. Our two debaters have been allocated 5 minutes each for opening remarks and 3 minutes each for rebuttals of those opening remarks. We'll then launch into an open debate for half an hour or so, during which time I will ask them questions. Each will have an opportunity to ask the other one question. At 7:30 or so, we'll turn to the audience for questions, and as we discussed, you can ask those questions through Twitter or index cards. Just before we finish up, around 8, just before 8, both Lance and Michael will receive 3 minutes each to provide a closing statement. We will then invite you to respond to the poll once again and see if your opinions have changed. So our panelists are really well poised to answer these questions. Michael Greenberg is going to argue that the government should stop gentrification. Michael is a frequent contributor to the New York Review of Books, where he wrote a story in August, Tenants Under Siege, Inside New York City's Housing Crisis, in which he detailed how landlords push out residents to make room for higher income tenants, and how a New York City tax break meant to encourage the development of affordable units may actually be displacing more people than it helps. Michael's memoir, Hurry Down Sunshine, has been translated into 18 languages, and he is currently working on a book about New York over the past 50 years. Please welcome Michael Greenberg. On my other side, Lance Freeman will argue that the government should not stop gentrification. Lance is a professor in the urban planning program and the director of the doctoral program in urban planning at Columbia University. He previously worked as a researcher at Mathematica Policy Research, a social policy research firm in Washington. Freeman is the author of the book, There Goes the Hood, Views of Gentrification from the Ground Up, in which he talked to residents of two predominantly black neighborhoods in New York City, Harlem and Clinton Hill, and found that longtime residents are more optimistic and supportive of gentrification than is often portrayed. Please welcome Lance Freeman. I'd like to remind both of our panelists that we have a great mix of people watching and listening today, so please don't get too wonky, and define any terms that you're going to use that the general public may not be familiar with. So Michael, we're on to your opening statement. You have 3 minutes. Go ahead.
5, I thought.
Oh, sorry, 5.
Yeah, okay. Okay, hello. So, should the government stop gentrification? It's a very broad question. And the very word gentrification carries a burden of social and political connotations that is way too much for one word to handle. But let's go with it. Should the government stop gentrification? I would rephrase it. Should the government protect hardworking, lower-wage earners from being dislodged from their homes because of an upturn in the fortune of some American cities, the upturn in the fortunes of some American cities? Because from housing flows everything: health, education, stability, emotional stability, and very often social life, community life. Without stable housing, it's almost impossible to build a decent existence. And the fact is that the government is already involved in housing, deeply involved. Mayors and city legislatures exercise more power in shaping the housing market than any force. They do this through zoning, their power to zone, tax exemptions, through their ability to encourage or discourage developers to build and where to build. They determine how tall a building will be, what its use will be, what level of service and transportation and policing and schooling a neighborhood will receive. This is true in all of what I call the chosen cities that are profiting from the new urban prosperity. And it's not all American cities by a long shot, but Boston, Washington, D.C., Seattle, Portland, Oregon, San Francisco, Los Angeles, Denver, even Philadelphia, where minimum wage earners must work 128 hours to afford an average two-bedroom, 128 hours a week to afford an average two-bedroom apartment, according to a study that was just published by the Philadelphia Inquirer. But let's take New York. And let's take specifically as an example the neighborhood of East New York in Brooklyn, one of the poorest districts in the city. In April 2016, East New York was rezoned for bigger apartment buildings, higher density as urban planners call it. All good in a city whose population is growing. It's expected to reach 9 million in about 15 years. The city promises to invest in the neighborhood. A new school, $257 million is what they've promised to invest in East New York as a compensation or as a promotion of this rezoning. New school, new park, public spaces, a renovated subway station, community policing, high-speed internet service. This is great. And this is all in a neighborhood where residents have been begging for basic services for decades. And the city invites developers then to build, giving them significant tax breaks that will help to ensure that their developments will be profitable over time. In return, the city says you have to make 25% of your newly constructed apartments affordable through a formula that we'll provide. And for the remaining 75%, you can charge whatever the market will bear. Again, great. The area becomes more mixed, more prosperous, with people of different incomes. But what happens is that tremendous pressure suddenly comes down on the tenants in the older buildings in the neighborhood, the buildings that were already there, the buildings that pre-existed zoning, and that people have been living in for decades. Because the neighborhood will change with a significant influx of wealthier residents who never would have considered moving there before the city intervened, the neighborhood starts to become gentrified. When the rezoning of East New York was announced, investment groups began buying up older rent-stabilized buildings and engaging in what has become a familiar pattern of unlocking value through tenant harassment and eviction. Prices shot up. Short-term speculators flipped buildings for an average return of 125%, the highest appreciation in all of New York in 2016. Often these buyers at these prices are private equity funds that manage pools of invested money. A typical participant in the market, in the Central Brooklyn market, for instance, describes itself as an asset investment firm that specializes in the repositioning of multi-family housing. What they mean by repositioning is the eviction of lower-paying tenants, even though these tenants are protected very often by rent stabilization. Those laws are weak enough for a patient, well-funded owner to circumvent and defeat.
All right, Michael, I'm going to have to stop you there. That's your 5 minutes, but you'll have 3 minutes soon.
Okay.
So we'll go back to that. Okay, Lance, the government should not stop gentrification. You have 5 minutes.
Okay, I have a tall order. I'm supposed to sway folks that the government should not act. It looks like it's running 2-1 against that proposition. So what I'm going to argue is that the government should not stop gentrification, but that doesn't mean that the government should do nothing, right? It also doesn't mean that other parties should not act collectively in the face of gentrification, right? And the reason I make that argument is that the way I see gentrification, I define it broadly in what could be considered neutral terms. It's when a neighborhood that's relatively low income, that has experienced disinvestment, then experiences an influx of higher income folks and investment. And with that, as Alana suggested, can come some positives. It can increase the tax base. It could bring in higher earning residents, which attracts more business. But there are downsides, right? There's direct displacement. People may no longer be able to afford to live in the neighborhood. There's also indirect displacement. People feel like they're being pushed out of their own communities, like they don't belong there, right? And that's certainly something that I think government and other parties should act to slow down or dampen somewhat. What I do think the government should do is try to provide affordable housing in neighborhoods that are experiencing gentrification, right? The city has tried to do that to some extent through its inclusionary housing program, but there's more that could be done. The government could try to target neighborhoods that are experiencing gentrification with affordable housing. It could try to set aside increases in property tax revenues in neighborhoods that are experiencing gentrification specifically for affordable housing. It's also the case that people in those communities, I think it's very important for them to mobilize and come together and try to address the challenges that gentrification brings. And that's something that may be beyond the powers of government to really affect. How do people interact with newcomers coming into the neighborhood? How do they interact with people who have more money who come into the neighborhood and try to change the norms of the neighborhood? I think it's a mobilized community that can address that more so than government. Okay. And finally, I think gentrification is one of those things that oftentimes, while it's the result of human action, to paraphrase some Scottish Enlightenment thinkers, it's not necessarily always the result of human design. And so gentrification is due in part to changing demographic patterns. People are marrying later, having children later, living longer as single adults. People like that tend to prefer central city living, right? Can the government really stop those types of changes? It would be hard pressed for the government to do that. Due to environmental concerns, people's changing taste about driving versus using public transportation, people prefer more walkable neighborhoods. Again, can government intervene to stop those types of changes in taste? I think it would be a tall order to expect the government to do that. So rather than saying that the government should stop gentrification, I think what we should look for is the government to step in and to address the challenges that gentrification brings, which I think many people are aware of.
Great. Okay, Michael, you have 3 minutes for rebuttal.
Okay, well, I certainly agree with much of that. I mean, a tax for to a property tax that would promote affordable housing by the city would be fantastic. I also would propose a sales tax for that. This transit system has a sales tax, although that money is mismanaged somewhat. It has a tax, and housing has no such thing. The problem, I think, and it's true the forces are beyond any governmental official's control, any elected official's control. Cities have been rediscovered, they've been embraced. Certain cities are chosen cities, as I call them. And there are reasons for that. And the problem is that there's a public-private collaboration or partnership that New York, for instance, is proposing. And I think the intentions are great, but the effect of this, it works, these public-private partnerships work for the High Line, maybe, or for Brooklyn Bridge Park, but they don't work for housing because developers demand way too much, and the city capitulates. And even affordable units are often, designated affordable units in neighborhoods are often more expensive than the people in those neighborhoods are used to paying or can pay. So it's a wrenching experience for a lot of people. And the amount of investment that this promotes in older private housing is disastrous for people. Investment is great in neighborhoods, but hyper-investment over a 3 or 4 year period, where buildings that used to sell for 10 or at most 12 times their rent roll, the amount of rent they collect in a year, are now selling for 30 times their rent roll in neighborhoods like Crown Heights and East Harlem. And the reason that happens is because they've factored in the displacement or somehow dislodging of those rent-stabilized tenants as part of their economic model. They have to dislodge everyone to make a profit at those prices. So we see indications of the scourge of dislodgement that happens, even with the city's good intentions. 18% severe overcrowding, an increase of 18% in 2016 alone. Overcrowding in apartments, that means people doubling up, moving with relatives, with friends, sleeping on couches. 127,000 different men, women, and children last year slept in city shelters. The shelters accommodate over 60,000 every single night. They're filled to the hilt. And
I think that's, sorry, that's your time.
Okay, just want to say that 75% of those homeless are families with children, and 1/3 of the adults in those families have jobs.
All right, thank you. Lance, you have 3 minutes for a rebuttal.
Sure, thank you. I agree with a lot of the sentiment that Michael is expressing regarding some of the problems that happens with some of the particular city programs that are in place. I would caution, though, that the idea that developing market rate housing in neighborhoods like East New York is something that we would just want to discourage across the board. It may be the case that the programs need to be redesigned or implemented in a different manner, but I would be very cautious against saying, well, we just don't want to have any market rate housing or at all built in neighborhoods like East New York. The reason I'm saying that is, as I alluded to earlier, part of what's driving gentrification, and Alana mentions this also, is that people want to move into the city. So if we don't build housing, whether it's in East New York or Williamsburg or wherever, where are those people going to go? They will eventually look for housing that is currently occupied by low and moderate income households. It's not as though if we don't build housing, they're just going to pack up and go back to Ohio or Westchester or wherever we imagine them coming from. They're going to go into those other neighborhoods. And so it won't necessarily stop the problem. It might indeed accelerate gentrification in some neighborhoods. What I do think needs to happen, and I think this administration perhaps more so than the previous, is that the burden of new housing needs to be spread more equitably. I think oftentimes it appears, and again, I think this administration might be doing a better job than the previous one, that low-income communities are the ones that are bearing the brunt of upzoning more so than middle-class neighborhoods in Queens or Staten Island or what have you. So I think in the view of equity and fairness, the downsides that do come with redevelopment should be spread more equitably throughout the city and across different socioeconomic groups. So it's not just low-income neighborhoods that are seeing their neighborhoods being upzoned, while some other neighborhoods are allowed to maintain low densities or even downzone in some instances.
Great. Well, I think we have some really interesting questions to get through. We're launching into the open debate now. So, Michael, I want to start with you. The argument you're making is that the government should stop gentrification. I'm just curious what that would look like when you think of the government stepping in to stop gentrification. What does that mean, and what kind of policies would that look like?
Well, it means that the government would take a more proactive role in providing housing for people in the 35,000, people and families in the 35,000 to 65,000 range, and the people who are most under stress right now. And almost all, a great many of those are working people. I believe, I love Lance's idea of a tax. I agree. I also would like a sales tax, which people think is a regressive tax, but I think that New Yorkers would agree, since this is Los Angeles recently voted a tax of a half a penny, a sales tax of a half a penny to build out mass transit, their most urgent need. This is New York's most urgent need. And the city would not be collaborating with private developers to do this. The city would enter the market, use not-for-profit developers, and build these buildings. We've learned a lot from public housing and the mistakes of public housing. These are buildings that could sit in every neighborhood. They could have 50 apartment units throughout the city. That's how I see it.
So you would see it as not necessarily preventing new people from moving in, but maybe more creating opportunities for people to stay in neighborhoods by building affordable housing. Is that right?
Yeah, you can't prevent people from moving in. It's impossible.
Lance, do you have any thoughts on how you would see the government stopping gentrification and what damage or positive benefits that would bring to a neighborhood?
I thought I was arguing the other side. No?
You are. No, I'm just curious
Okay.
if you, if the government did step in and
Right.
stop gentrification. I think you made a really interesting point that in a lot of time, in a lot of ways, this brings investment into neighborhoods. What would happen to neighborhoods if that investment did not come in?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think if the government tried to stop it and it was successful in some sense, you would almost see neighborhoods freezing and almost frozen in time to some extent. We look at neighborhoods and we see them changing, and that jars us, but we have to remember neighborhoods are dynamic. You know, people move in and out all the time. People die, people move away. So part of the change, when we see neighborhoods not appearing to change, what's happening is that the people coming in are just sort of much similar to the people who are already there. So it would mean that the neighborhood, the government was somehow intervening to keep that flow going on. In some ways, that could be challenging. I mean, some of the same forces that are attracting the gentrifiers to the city, other folks are moving to other places. You know, for example, African Americans have been migrating away from New York for decades now. A lot of African Americans, for example, are seeing the South as a better place to pursue opportunities. And so how do you change that dynamic so that you can continue to attract, for example, African Americans to come into neighborhoods like Harlem, for example? Not sure the city is well positioned to execute that. I do think the city can help people who want to stay there and continue to move in, but in terms of redirecting these broader demographic patterns, the return of African Americans to the South, for example, I'm not so sure how the city would go about doing that.
Yeah, I think Lance makes an interesting point, which is that government has in the past gotten into the role of providing housing for people. You know, we had an era where government built lots of public housing, and you saw it you saw cities become very segregated. You saw places like Cabrini Green pop up. So how does the government build affordable housing or get into the game without creating more segregation and without recreating what already happened in a lot of cities, which was segregation where there was affordable housing, but really nothing else?
Well, the 60s and 50s and 40s, and it stopped in the 70s, model of public housing was developments that were turned away from the street, that became worlds unto themselves with thousands of units. And this created communities that were cut off from other parts of the city, and it was a mistake. It was a grave mistake that I think we've learned a lot from. I don't think it's not necessarily even about racial, it's about income. And if you have housing, is the city going to protect its population that has been greatly responsible for creating its prosperity? It's low wages, it's hard work. These are citizens, and they're a large swath of our citizens, over 30%. The city needs to protect those people in some way. They're extremely vulnerable under the current system, even in New York, which has rent. And I think that it would work. It should be in all neighborhoods, not just East New York, and I totally agree with Lance about the upzoning burden that's in poorer neighborhoods and outlying neighborhoods. I think it should be on the Upper East Side everywhere, Upper West Side.
Well, Lance, I think you have maybe found that certain people of certain incomes do not need to be protected, or that they were able to stay when new tenants came in. And I'm wondering, I know in your research a lot of the people were homeowners, but how were other people able to stay when gentrification came to the neighborhood?
Yeah, that's a good question. So home ownership is obviously one way. Some people are fortunate enough to have rent regulation, and so I think the city has this debate about rent regulation every few years. I mean, to the extent you want to help people stay in their neighborhoods, rent regulation does do that. And so anything that erodes rent regulation, whatever the upsides of that, to the extent that we're interested in helping people stay in their community, rent regulation is another important tool. Some people in smaller buildings had personal relationships with their landlords, and the landlords didn't charge the market rent. So not all landlords would necessarily, jack up the rent and evict and effectively displace someone if they had a long-standing tenant who they had a good relationship with that was reliable. That was another way that people were able to stay. Sometimes people are able to stay, though, in ways that are not so good, right? Sometimes people have to double and triple up. Sometimes they have to spend an exorbitant amount of their income for rent. So people are able to stay in some ways that are positive. They have a rent-regulated apartment, they own their home, they live in public housing, and their landlord is kind to them or has a good relationship with them. And other times they're not such a good way. They're overcrowded, they're spending 50% of their income for rent. So it's a combination of things, I think, that sometimes helps people to be able to stay.
Now, Michael, I know in your article you had some very specific prescriptions for what the de Blasio administration could do differently in terms of rent regulation, in terms of allowing people to stay. What are some of the biggest changes that you'd like to see, if we're talking specifically about New York City, in helping people stay in their homes and avoid when gentrification comes?
Well, New York has a very progressive and unique to this country, which doesn't like to regulate housing, at least not in the way of, to get in the way of profit. It has regulated housing throughout, since the 20s and 30s. But those laws weaken and are strengthened in different periods, and they've been weakened since 1994 considerably. For instance, we have a vacancy law, which is when somebody leaves their apartment and a new tenant comes in, the landlord can jack up the rent by 20%. We have something called preferential rent, which in neighborhoods like East New York, Crown Heights, Bedford-Stuyvesant, Harlem, East Harlem, Washington Heights, when those the amount of money that they're allowed to increase their rent by the Rent Guideline Board in these stabilized units are not levied, and then suddenly they're levied all at once on a tenant. And I'm going to tell the story in my closing statements of a tenant who is not unique, on someone I know who has gone through this. So those loopholes should be closed and need to be closed, and tenants would have a lot more protection. De Blasio has done, he has, with the help of the city council, with the pressure from city council, has made sure that anyone earning less than $50,000 a year who is in housing court facing eviction has a public defender, which I think is a great thing, because there are a lot of spurious lawsuits that are brought to intimidate tenants who don't know their rights, or who don't have the wherewithal to do anything about it or navigate housing court.
So, Lance, if the de Blasio administration or another administration in New York implemented some of those regulations, do you think that would have negative effects on developing neighborhoods?
Well, there probably would be some cost to that. There's cost associated with rent regulation, right? I think the question is, are the costs, do the benefits outweigh the cost?
Sorry,
right?
can you be a little, what are the costs associated with rent regulation?
Well, rent regulation, on the one hand, it does help people to stay in their residences, which we can portray as a positive. But you could also say there's a downside to that, right? If you want people to be, the economy to be dynamic, if you want people to move where there are greater opportunities. Encouraging people to stay in place is not always the best thing, right? There's been some studies that suggest that, well, the data suggests that people move a lot less now than they did 20, 30, 50 years ago. There's some positives to that, right? People, when they stay in place, they build social connections, helps them build community. At the same time, when people move to take advantage of opportunities, right? That's what creates, I mean, if you look at the US is built on people moving about, either voluntarily or involuntarily being brought here, right? People moving from the south to the north, people moving to the west. So to the extent that you want a dynamic economy where people move to take advantage of opportunities, there is a downside to providing incentives for people to stay in place. So I think the challenge is to think about how do you weigh those. You know, you don't want to see people necessarily forced out of their homes or feel like they're being pushed out of their homes, yet at the same time, you don't want to sort of cement people in place or freeze communities and times. The economy, society is dynamic, and so it's a balancing act to think about how do you do that, and so I think any debate has to consider that as well. I think oftentimes people talk past one another, you know, it's going to raise costs if we have any regulation, or it's going to stifle development. But I mean, I think there's pros and cons, and we have to think about how can we affect policies that take in consideration both the pros and the cons of these types of regulations.
So Michael, why not, you go to downtown Brooklyn, you go to a lot of cities across America, you see a lot of developments going up, there's a lot of building going on. Why not just rely on the market? I mean, America is a capitalist society. Why not just rely on the market to build a lot of apartments? People will move into that, maybe take some of the pressure off the middle income residents or renters.
Well, I mean, that hasn't worked. I mean, that doesn't work in a period when there's an influx into cities of people of greater means who previously didn't live in cities. In New York, in fact, what you have is a glut of, but you don't have a housing shortage in New York. You have a shortage of affordable housing. You have a glut of housing at the $3,500 a month and up level. A glut, vacancies. You go to one of these buildings and they offer you 2 months free rent and free concierge service and whatever. They're dying for tenants. They've overbuilt, in fact. It's only a sector of the market that's regulated. It's a considerable sector. We have 990,000 rent-regulated apartments in New York, which is about 40% of the rental market in New York. And it's precious. They're almost all pre-war buildings, pre-World War II buildings. They're a precious asset to the city, as precious as its transit system, I think, and as its parks. So I don't think the completely unregulated market works.
Okay. Lance, what do you think about a completely unregulated market?
Yeah, I mean, the problem with housing, or I don't know if it's a problem, but the reality of housing, it's not like shoes, right? A bunch of people come to New York City, they need more shoes, prices of shoes go up, shoe builders build more shoes, they could build some cheap shoes, some designer shoes, and everybody's happy, right? With housing, more people come into the community, you need more housing, but if you build housing across the street from me, you block my view, increases congestion, makes my kids' school more crowded. So it affects other people, right? And that's why a completely unregulated housing market is unrealistic, right? Because it's not like shoes, for example, where if I go out and buy a pair of shoes, it doesn't affect anybody else. Maybe you don't like the color or whatever, but it's not affecting your quality of life. If I decide to build a house across the street from you, that can affect your quality of life depending on what type of house I build. And so completely unfettered, unregulated market is not realistic. You have to have some type of controls, and the challenge is to think about designing them in a way that allows for development that meets increasing demand, yet at the same time provides options for people who, maybe need subsidies or what have you.
I know you've written about some ideas for how to both encourage development and also create opportunities for people to stay in the neighborhood. Are there some ideas that you'd like to kind of put out there that we can kind of go over?
Yeah, well, I mentioned one of them, right? So I think if you have a neighborhood that's experiencing gentrification, housing prices are going up, property values are going up, property taxes are also increasing. Why not set aside some of that increment specifically for people living in that community? I think that's one step you could take that would help specifically the people who live in that community.
That money would go to create housing for them, or how?
You
how would
could
it be used?
design it in different ways. You could give it to that. You could use it to build housing. You could even use it in the form of a voucher. Maybe people need subsidized housing. Maybe they don't want to necessarily stay in the neighborhood, but they still need a subsidy. They want to go somewhere else. So it wouldn't necessarily have to target people in those communities. One advantage of that is that the pushback that you see when neighborhoods are experiencing gentrification from some people in the community is because they don't feel like it's going to benefit them, and savvy communities that know how to work the system can stop development. It doesn't always happen in low-income communities, but many other types of neighborhoods are able to stop development in their communities because they know how to work the land use review system. They know how to ask for environmental impact statements and what have you. And so poor, disadvantaged communities are learning that game to some extent as well. And so I think, you want to give some incentives for people to accept development in their community. And there's also, I think, a normative argument that could be made in terms of social justice, that the people living in those communities that in the past had experienced disinvestment, sometimes they had experienced redlining, should reap some of the benefits when the neighborhoods start to rebound.
I'm wondering if either of you has examples of a city or neighborhood that kind of proves your point that, the government maybe did stop gentrification and it turned out well for everyone involved, or the government didn't and it turned out well for everyone involved.
I can't really think of one. I can't think of a neighborhood. I mean, we mentioned when we were talking backstage, as it were, the neighborhood in Boston, where there's a kind of a land trust. That's a unique and unusual situation. I think, it's interesting because the earliest stages of gentrification, which Lance has written very eloquently about, do kind of create a temporary sort of urban, I wouldn't say utopia, but better world. When you have neighborhoods that were not integrated at all, that were deeply segregated, that had been starved of investment, suddenly becoming integrated without a lot of displacement. City is not intervening, it's just people moving in. And, I think in early stages of gentrification in places like the East Village, which is now completely gentrified, and you cannot find an affordable house there, home there, or in Fort Greene or in other areas, that has happened, but it's short-lived. And gentrification, the problem is that it's accelerated. The economic model has accelerated so quickly that what took 25 years now happens in 4 years.
So it sounds like you're maybe skeptical of the kind of utopia that Lance says can perhaps exist when new residents come to a neighborhood and old residents are able to stay. You're skeptical that that exists.
I'm skeptical that that balance can be held without it tipping too far over and jeopardizing the security and really threatening the very well-being of longer-term tenants. Lance mentions, redlining. I mean, absolutely. You had a flight of white working-class people to the suburbs or to the Sun Belt because of more jobs there at a certain time, but a lot of times because they were being offered their own homes, and it was being promoted by the government. Here, the government was absolutely shaping the market. shaping the suburban market and leaving inner cities, as it's sometimes called, as was called in those days, starved of investment. And now those same people who were left out of buying homes by the government are not being protected by the government now that their neighborhoods have suddenly become, what do we call it, attractive.
You're talking about redlining and then also the mortgage interest reduction that kind of allowed people to buy homes in the
Yes,
suburbs.
and the whole housing thing from the FHA that began in the 30s is very well documented by The Color of Law, Ed Rothstein's recent book, which is an excellent book. And it's been documented in many ways.
Lance, any examples of when the government did not stop gentrification and it turned out okay?
When it did not stop gentrification
Right.
and it turned out okay. That's a tricky one. I mean, the most I can say is okay for whom, right? I mean, I think there are instances where it turned out okay for some people, right? People maybe who happen to own their homes, people who moved into the neighborhoods. There's a good book about downtown Brooklyn by Suleiman Osman. I think it's The Making of Brownstone Brooklyn. And he describes how neighborhoods like Bowen Hill, those neighborhoods right at Dumbo, how those neighborhoods started experiencing gentrification in the 1950s, even 1960s. And neighborhoods like that, and I think other neighborhoods that were predominantly industrial in nature, where you didn't have a large resident population, perhaps the transformation was not as traumatic because there weren't that many people living there. Perhaps there were some businesses that were displaced, but we tend to be, not saying we're less sympathetic to businesses necessarily, but we expect businesses to, die and go out of business all the time. So I think instances where gentrification has happened in predominantly industrial neighborhoods where they were formerly industrial, but because the economy changed and there's no longer significant demand for those particular types of spaces, gentrification has happened, and it's not as, the downsides are not as apparent as when it happens in predominantly residential neighborhoods. And perhaps in those instances, there's less of an argument for a big role for the government to play to try to slow or stop the process, I would say.
Yeah, I thought you'd say maybe the neighborhoods that you researched, the government didn't stop gentrification and
Well, the neighborhoods I looked at were Harlem and Clinton Hill and Brooklyn. And the government was heavily involved in both of those, and so were community groups. I wouldn't say that the government played no role. I mean, I think Harlem, for example, there's still a lot of public housing in Harlem. There was a significant amount of affordable housing built through the low-income housing tax credit in Harlem. There was an empowerment zone in Harlem, so you really couldn't make the case that there was no government intervention. There was probably less in Clinton Hill, but even in Clinton Hill, there's a historic district, right, which again is a government playing a role there. So I think in both of those instances, the government did play a role, both in, you could say, slowing down or addressing some of the challenges due to gentrification. And some people would argue also some of the things the government did, rezoning on 125th Street, may accelerate some aspects of gentrification as well.
well, I want to see if either of you have a question you want to ask the other that we haven't gotten to. Michael, do you have a question for Lance?
I can't think of one. I really can't, but I wish I could.
Okay, Lance, what about you?
Well, I guess, when your thoughts about, Michael, your thoughts about stopping gentrification, what role do the gentrifiers play? If the goal is to stop gentrification, what would you say to gentrifiers who are the ones doing the gentrifying?
Well, stopping gentrification is a bit broad, as strongly mitigating its effects in certain places. I think the gentrifiers are doing just fine, except that the gentrifiers are often exploited too, because when you have these neighborhoods that suddenly turn over and they're gouging rents and they're turning 2 bedrooms into 3 bedrooms, or 4 bedrooms, or 1 bedroom into 2 bedrooms, and their gentrifiers very often are just elementary school teachers or people with middle class, even wages, who are looking for an affordable place to live. And they're young, and they're doubling up, and they're maybe web journalists, and all the things that New York provides, the kind of employment New York provides. Maybe they're musicians, maybe they're working in the fashion world as on a low level, in the magazine world. And so I think gentrifiers themselves sometimes, we tend to think of the gentrifier as a monolithic money bag. But in fact, that's not the case. So I think more city intervention from a good progressive mayor like de Blasio would be great.
Well, I'll ask Lance one question to maybe try to get a few more people on your side. I thought you brought up a really interesting point, which was a lot of times we talk about moving people in cities to suburbs, moving low-income people to higher income areas, because that will bring them opportunity. I'm wondering what role you see gentrification having in kind of wider integration of incomes and in race, in how can it result in something positive for the people that stay?
Yeah, that's a good question. There has been a movement and some discussion, not on a significant scale, I don't think, but towards encouraging mixed income housing, toward avoiding concentrating in people in pockets of poverty, such as what was done with public housing in many instances. And so gentrification, in theory at least, could, in some instances, reverse some of that, right? You take neighborhoods right here in New York City, for example, like Harlem, Bedford-Stuyvesant, East Harlem, that were, highly segregated through much of the 20th century, and for the first time, you start to see a significant influx of whites and, sometimes middle-class whites. And so it can create some integration. I think the challenge is to make sure it's something that's sustainable and not something that just goes from, a segregated, predominantly Black or Hispanic community to a segregated, predominantly white community in a period of 10 or 20 years or what have you. So I think that's another reason why I think it's important to make sure there is affordable housing, make sure that people who want to stay in the community, and also people who want to move into those communities who may not be able to afford to do it, right? So if you want to maintain a diverse neighborhood, you not only have to protect the people who are there, but you also have to provide opportunities for people who may lack the income to move into those communities. Otherwise, eventually the people who are living there are going to die or move away. So you have to provide subsidies if need be, protect regulation, if your goal is to maintain a diverse neighborhood, as a way of allowing people to continue to move in the neighborhood and maintain diversity in terms of income and race. And I think some of the advantages of that could be more integrated schools, more integrated communities, perhaps less political polarization across racial lines and ethnic lines. That's a sort of optimistic view anyway, but I think those are some of the positives that could result from that.
Okay, thanks. Well, we're now going to turn to the audience questions. So as a reminder, you can do this over Twitter or if you have index cards. So our first question comes from an index card here in the room. It is for either one of you or both. How do you quantify the value of cultural loss of a neighborhood? How do you quantify the value of cultural loss a neighborhood will see as a result of gentrification? We know about the socioeconomic aspects, but does the government have a responsibility to maintain the cultural identity of places like Bed-Stuy or Harlem?
Well, that's a very tricky question. I mean, then you're getting into designated cultural zones that should be frozen in a certain way. Cities are dynamic, and I think culture springs up and culture moves. And it's never, so I think that there is a discomfort among people who are used to having a certain cultural presence in their neighborhood and they're part of that culture and they've contributed to that culture, to see that neighborhood turn. And I think it's difficult. I think it's psychologically and emotionally difficult for people. When the government gets involved in cultural preservation, what we tend to get are museums areas where it's sort of dead. Culture is everything. I mean, it's how we eat, it's how we live.
Lance, do you want to try to tackle that question?
Yeah, I mean, I think the cultural significance of certain neighborhoods can be very important, and to the extent people value it, steps should be taken to preserve it. I don't necessarily think the government is the entity to play that role. I think it's something that people in the community have to come together and to the extent they value the culture, to try to take steps to preserve it. I'm skeptical that the government can play a really big role in saying, well, let's say, for example, we're gonna preserve the African-American legacy of Harlem. I think it falls upon the people in the community to come together and think about ways to strategize. How can we preserve the culture that we have here? Because it was the people who came together, for example, using the example of Harlem again, that created the culture in the first place, right? That set in motion the Harlem Renaissance, for example, and what have you. So just as it wasn't the government that said, well, let's create this culture here, they may have played a role in segregating people there, but creating the rich cultural heritage there, that was the people in the community that created it, and I think it falls upon the people in the community to think about ways to preserve it. I'm not so sure the government can play a big role in that.
So both seem to agree on something. Here's a question for Michael from Twitter. Interesting that you said gentrification isn't about race but income, but they're so highly correlated. How do you separate them?
Well, you don't. I mean, they're not separable, but there are gentrifiers from every culture and race and country, and there are poor people in New York and in other cities from every culture and race. What I'm saying is that if you used that $35,000 to $65,000 band and had the government giving more protection to those people, to those families, race would, it would work. It would work. It just doesn't have to be done on racial grounds, but we will find probably that a lot of the people in that band are African American or Latino.
Interesting. Okay, here's one for Lance from the website. Are there any examples of non-governmental forces that help slow or prevent displacement of residents as a result of economic development or gentrification? If so, what are they?
Non-governmental forces. Well, certainly people can come together and mobilize, form community groups, and one of the things that they can do is when the neighborhood is starting to change and people are coming into the neighborhood, they can put in place sort of mechanisms that would incorporate people into the community, where they can address sort of competing visions of the community so that you don't have one group coming into the neighborhood, and I think the perception is oftentimes that the gentrifiers are taking over the neighborhood. They're trying to dictate what the neighborhood should look like now. And people want to make the neighborhood comfortable for themselves. That's probably a sort of a natural human reaction. But if you have mechanisms set up or you have a sort of infrastructure in place so that people can come together from diverse backgrounds, right? You can address some of those conflicts that end up making people feel like they're being pushed out of their own community, right? And so that doesn't speak necessarily to the pricing, but sometimes when people talk about being pushed out, they're not necessarily talking about the landlord raised their rent or what have you. They're talking about that the culture of their community is changing and they don't feel like they have a voice in that process. And so to the extent they do feel like they have a voice, I would think they would be less likely to feel like they're being pushed out And that's something that doesn't necessarily involve the government. You could just have a neighborhood group, a block group, or a block association, or what have you. So I think that's something that people in the community themselves could do that doesn't necessarily involve the government. I mean, the government could be involved, like in New York City, we have community districts, for example, community boards, but it doesn't necessarily have to be something that's instigated by the government.
Well, I agree with Lance, just very quickly about the power of community groups. And for instance, in East New York, which I used as an example in my opening remarks, there's a group of pastors with very large congregations, some of them in the thousands, who pressure, build housing, pressure the city for the interests of their congregants and the congregants' families and neighbors, which in some cases is the same as the interests of the neighborhood, and that can be very effective. So I do think that I totally agree.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
having a voice, both of you think, is having people feel like they have a voice. Here's a really interesting question from an index card. So we've talked about the social incentives about stopping gentrification and the rights of tenants, the kind of human decency argument. But is there an economic argument around preventing gentrification? What are the government's economic incentives to stop gentrification, if there are any?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the incentives run the other way, but I can imagine some scenarios whereby gentrification could lead to the loss of much of the working class population, for the people who are police officers, teachers, nurses, retail clerks, what have you. And so when that happens, people have to commute in, or they have to come from somewhere, right? Or it could become difficult for businesses to staff their operations, or what have you, right? So that could drive up retail costs, or it could drive up traffic congestion or commuting costs. So those are some, potential downsides. I think, New York City has really good public, well, I guess depends on your perspective, but relatively, it has an extensive public transportation system. But, some places, the Bay Area is a good example where people are forced to commute for hours to get to work. Those are sort of costs that are oftentimes hidden, right? They don't really show up, but there's costs in terms of pollution, in terms of traffic congestion, lost time, in terms of people getting to work. So those are some costs associated from gentrification in terms of, why you might want to dampen it down somewhat.
Michael, any thoughts on the
Well, I agree
economic
that,
costs?
we've moved, New York and most major cities have moved from being production centers to consumption centers, and the service industry is central. Hotel workers, fast food workers, clerks, et cetera, and they are essential to the city. And also there's something else. Successful cities are predicated on a collision of classes, of people, of languages, of cultures. You cannot have a dynamic city if you don't have a middle class or a working class that can live in the city, alongside the city. We can see what's happened to Paris, for instance, where everyone has been pushed out to I can never pronounce the Banlieue. And you have this old central Paris where you'd be hard-pressed to find someone under 45 years old walking the street, and it's kind of dead in a certain way compared to what it was. I mean, I'm not saying Paris is dead, but we run the danger of becoming that kind of city. And this has been a European model in certain ways, and I think that's something for us to avoid.
Okay, another question from Twitter. So you're 20-something, you're moving to New York City, like many of the people perhaps in this room. What should you do? Where should you live? What can you do to minimize displacement and segregation?
What can you do to minimize it? You mean in your own choices?
If you're an individual, you're moving to New York,
Right.
you don't want to become one of those big, bad, evil gentrifiers, but you also need an affordable place to live. Where do you go? What do you do? This is for either of you.
Well, I think you go where you can find an apartment that you're comfortable with, and if that makes you a gentrifier, that doesn't make you a criminal. The fact is that, are you sensitive to your community? I happen to live in central Brooklyn. I see a lot of people move in there who have no interest in the community, no young people, no interest in the history of the community or the people living there at all. And they don't say hello to anybody. These are blocks where people say hello. A lot of newcomers don't say hello. So there's an insensitivity to the community and the culture that I think breeds a lot of anxiety and resentment. And so I would say, open your eyes to where you are. It doesn't have to accommodate to you. You should be accommodating to it.
So again, this community engagement sounds like it's
New
very
York
important.
is a city of communities, and people from suburbs don't understand this.
Lance, if you're
Well, Lance, I know you moved to West
I mean, I would echo that point. I think rather than so much saying, well, I'm not going to move to neighborhood X because it's going to increase prices, it's more about how do you behave when you move to neighborhood X? Do you behave in a way that you're sensitive to the people who are you a good neighbor, basically, right? I mean, when you move to a new neighborhood, do you embrace your neighbors or try to learn from the neighbors? Doesn't mean the neighborhood can't change or you can't, voice your own opinions about the neighborhood, but, don't just come in and try to bogart the neighborhood and say, I'm going to make the neighborhood, in my view, what it should be like. It's, being sensitive to the people who are living there, what their concerns are, their practices and what have you.
So you might still be displacing people, but if you're communicating over it, it's okay.
Well, I mean, I don't think individuals, can individually redirect the market, I guess would be my point.
Yeah.
So.
Exactly. Individuals don't make the market. It's the way markets are capitalized. I don't want to sound like a Marxist. I'm not a Marxist, but it's the way markets are capitalized. So it's really not on the individual.
Okay, that's a relief for some people in the room, I'm sure. Okay, here's another question from Twitter for either one of you. Neither the market nor the government has kept up with the huge housing demand in the city. Knowing how expensive it is to build in New York, instead of stopping gentrification, shouldn't the government create policies to lower the cost of construction in the city overall?
Well, good luck with that. I mean, in fact, 421A, which is the big tax abatement that funds, that entices builders to build, and there's significant tax. The city is going to give away at least $10 billion in uncollected taxes for these affordable, these mixed units, buildings, was stalled precisely because construction unions wouldn't accept less than, I think it's $70 an hour in Manhattan and at least $45 or $50 an hour in Brooklyn. And any attempt to do this, de Blasio actually did try, and Cuomo, in their ever-evolving and fruitless feud, put the kibosh on it and made himself look like a union supporter.
What do you think about policies to make construction more?
Yeah, definitely. I'm not in a position to really pinpoint the exact rules or regulations that need to be altered, but certainly I know, for example, in developing the Second Avenue subway, the cost per mile is orders of magnitude higher than subways that have been built in other cities around the world. Construction costs in New York City are very high compared to many other places. So, anything that you can do to make it cheaper to build housing. I mean, construction technology is basically the same across wherever you are. So, to the extent that you could lower it in New York, that would certainly be a big help. So, I definitely think steps should be taken to try to do that.
A question we maybe should have done earlier on, but this is from Twitter as well. Does gentrification necessarily cause displacement? Lance, you want to start with that one?
Yeah, I think, well, in part it depends on how you're defining displacement, right? So if by displacement you mean someone is evicted from their home, it doesn't have to happen. As I mentioned earlier, some people, if they live in a rent-regulated apartment, for example, or if they own their home, for example, they might be able to stay in the neighborhood despite the neighborhood being gentrified. The other type of displacement that I also talked about, the more indirect form where people feel like they don't belong in the neighborhood, or where people who live outside the neighborhood but maybe would have moved into the neighborhood, that is a little bit harder to avoid, right? Because if the neighborhood is becoming more expensive, then people who don't live there won't have an opportunity to move into the neighborhood unless there are some types of subsidies or other types of affordable housing being made available to them. And if the character of the neighborhood changes, and it changes in a way that the people who were formerly there feel excluded, right? That type of dynamic, right? That's part of the gentrification process. So unless there's some type of intervention to try to slow that down, prevent that, or alter that trajectory, that would entail displacement. So I guess it can happen, you know, in terms of direct displacement. You can have gentrification, and you can have people remain in their homes through a variety of mechanisms, some of which I mentioned earlier. But the other types of displacement also have to be considered as well. And I think a lot of times when people talk about being pushed out, they're talking about that in addition to being directly displaced.
Okay, now we're going to have to move on to the closing statements. So each of the panelists now has 3 minutes for their closing statement. Lance, we're going to have you go first.
Sure, thanks. You know, I think I would just sort of recap what I've said this evening. And again, I think my argument is that I would not argue that the government should try to stop gentrification, but it doesn't mean that we shouldn't do anything, that we should just throw up our hands and say that, you know, we're going to let the market run its course or what have you. There is a role for government to play in addressing some of the challenges that come with gentrification. And there is also a big role for other groups to play, community organizations, churches, other religious organizations and the like. Those are not necessarily governmental entities, but they also can play a very important role in addressing some of the downsides to gentrification. And I would add that, although I spoke of gentrification as something that can happen without, you know, human design, sometimes the government does step in and plan gentrification, right? So the government can implement policies. For example, in many cities, New York City hasn't really done this much, but in many cities, the government has went and demolished public housing, right? And replaced it with market rate, or in some instances, mixed income housing, right? So that's a proactive government step that's causing gentrification in those particular instances. Now, we can also debate the merits of those specific programs. So those are instances where one could argue that the government is causing gentrification, and if you don't like that particular policy or that particular instance, you could make the case that the government in that instance should, it's not so much that they should stop it, but they should not be promoting it or instigating it.
Great. Okay. Michael, you have 3 minutes for your closing statement.
Okay, thanks. Well, I don't think, the question, I think, is, for many of us, is what kind of city do we want to live in? And I don't think any of us certainly could have foreseen the wealth gap that's occurred in the United States and that's concentrated in its most wealthy cities, or how severe. We're in a new Gilded Age, and as in the first Gilded Age 100 years ago, income and wealth disparities have reached unfathomable proportions, grotesque proportions, and they affect housing in New York, and because they affect distribution of income. In 2002, New York City's wealthiest 1% took in 27% of the city's income, which is quite a bit. In 2012, they took in 45%, double the share of the national 1%, which in itself is higher than any developed country in the world. By contrast, in 2014, the bottom 50% of wage earners made due on 5.6% of the city's income, down from 7.5% in 2006. This is a serious redistribution of income. And it makes it very difficult for people to live to afford housing. Now, at the same time, these cities are richer than they've ever been. New York's budget has reached $80 billion this year, a new record. Expansion and growth are constant. But behind this wildfire of construction and new restaurants and retail outlets and music halls and bars and tech and media startups and nearly full employment in New York, housing costs have made, and increased income in a lot of New York, housing costs have made many, many people poorer. Since 2002, the bottom 20% of New Yorkers, for the bottom 20% of New Yorkers, rents have increased by 30% faster than income. And median rents across the city, all rental properties, rose by 75% in that same period, twice the national average. Now, I was going to tell the experience of someone I know, and I thought that was an opportunity to sort of describe the dynamic of the kind of hyper-capitalization that hits very suddenly and in one shot neighborhoods, but the sign says 30 seconds, so I'm not going to tell that story. But I think the question is, should people be uprooted because of an economic boom? And especially, and moreover, people who have contributed to this boom.
And that is your time.
And that is my time.
Okay, I'd like to invite the audience to respond to the poll again, just to see where we are now. Again, you can text DOTC to 37607 and respond with yes, no, or undecided, or you can visit the website pollev.com/DOTC and select an answer from the prompts. While everyone's doing that, I want to ask Michael and Lance, have either of you changed your mind about the initial question or any of the things that we have gone over tonight?
No, I haven't changed my mind, but Lance has broadened my sense of it all by a lot. And I'm not surprisingly, really, because I knew we would. We agree on a lot of things.
Great. What about you, Lance?
Yeah, I think I agree with a lot of what Michael said. So it was a pleasure debating him and learning from his insights about the topic.
Great. Well, the results are in, and they are, drum roll. Oh. Oh, okay. Well, we will put them on the web later. Oh, okay. Oh, so I'll remind you, before we started the debate, the resolution was the government should stop gentrification. It was 49% said yes, the government should stop gentrification. 25% said no, and 25% were undecided. And we're still getting results, but it looks like, Lance, you convinced some people. We now have yes at 32%, no at 47%, and undecided, come on people, make up your minds, is 21%. So great. Well, I think we've had a really interesting discussion. And I want to thank both Michael and Lance for their time and for their insights into this. And thank you all so much for coming.
Okay, good evening, ladies and gentlemen.